innovation not only has impact on businesses and consumers, but also on regulators and market authorities. One way to respond is to combine general competition oversight, sector-specific regulation, and consumer protection in one single authority. But what exactly is needed for effective oversight in a constantly changing environment? The best innovation, according to our next speaker, the aeroplane.
I'm enormously grateful to Chris, to the ACM community for the wonderful opportunity to speak at this program and to celebrate the anniversary of an institution that I regard with enormous respect. We don't celebrate anniversaries to celebrate longevity for its own sake. In many ways, it's an opportunity to look ahead, to think about what might come in the future and what progress has been achieved to date. And I'd like to do that by looking both at the challenges that an institution faces in achieving good integrated policy results, and to look at the approach that the ACM has taken to this and to anticipate what may lie ahead for it. I spent most of my life as an academic and had basically 10 years to spend at the Federal Trade Commission after I had worked as an academic. And before going there, I had a long conversation with one of my colleagues, Ron Spector, who teaches history at George Washington. He's a military historian, and he studies military history as a way of understanding organizations. One of his favorite stories about organizations is a young Canadian officer who goes to sea with very little experience in the early 40s to head a convoy leading a warship with very little experience, and he's weaving dangerously through the convoy. There's a British destroyer that sends a message by a blinkered light to him that says, "What do you think you were doing?" And he answers back, "Learning a lot." For an academic, going from the Tower of Ivory to see theory meet practice, for me, one of the most powerful lessons is the extent to which the process of implementation and institutional design tend to be underrated as an important element of the policy decision-making process. A blind spot, not a fatal weakness, but a blind spot of the academy is the tendency to focus on the good conceptual idea at the expense of thinking about how it works. I spent 3 years of my life in a law firm where the principal client I worked for was then called McDonnell Douglas, and that explains my fascination with airplanes, not just as a user, but watching them built. And I spent a great deal of time talking to engineers about how they built aircraft and what the essence of a good aircraft was. And the repeated, emphasized answer was engineering. Not just experience, but engineering. One of them had worked extensively on the Apollo program. McDonnell Douglas built parts of the vehicle that went to the moon, and he said the physics of going to the moon was pretty simple. You have to go fast enough to escape the Earth's gravity, you have to loop around the moon, a little bit of a push to get home, but that's pretty straightforward. He said the engineering of going to the moon was very difficult. In the policymaking discussion in the academy, we slight engineering to a dramatic degree. We focus a lot on the physics of policymaking, but it's the engineering that determines whether the great idea succeeds or not. When I was an undergraduate, the first political science text that was offered to me was a just published book by Graham Allison called The Essence of Decision. And Allison concludes his book with a terribly mournful assessment of public policy making in the United States. He said, if we're going to get better results, we better think hard about closing what he called the last mile, the mile between the idea and its effective application in practice. And we have not done that. And we better think a lot harder about how to accomplish that, or many of the great ideas about what government institutions should do, could do, simply will be unfulfilled or fulfilled in a way that is decidedly unsatisfying. I want to talk first about the challenges to public institutions, to competition and consumer protection agencies in doing a good job, and then to talk about the experience of the ACM and to talk about its progress to date, the wisdom, I think, of the conceptual design and the process to date of making it work. And in doing this, I'm not just going to talk about the ACM, I'm going to talk about the experience of the agency I worked for. The Federal Trade Commission is 100 years old in September. And in many ways, its experience sheds a lot of light on some of the design choices and problems that one faces in doing things well. Three basic challenges. The first challenge deals with what I essentially would call the problem of policy complexity, which is directly related to economic complexity. Big problem for the public institution is that the relevant commercial phenomena change dramatically. It's a conceit of the modern era to think that we live in an era that is so complex that it has no precedent. To some extent, that's not right. To go back to the FTC's first decade, it's the teens in the US, the FTC was confronted from day one with a host of commercial upheavals that were enormously bewildering to policy officials. There was this new transport device called the automobile. And the automobile was changing the behavior of individuals, laborers, but it was also changing dramatically commerce, because it now was possible to drive a distance and shop at a thing that was the forerunner of what we would call today the supermarket, the hypermarket. That converted the reliance on relatively small shops into greater dependence on larger chain enterprises that functioned in a completely different way. There was the evolution and emergence of this remarkable new communications device called the telephone, which had similar transformative effects. And what do you do with this telephone? How should it be controlled? How many telephone companies should you have? Where should they be located? How should they be owned? How should they be overseen? Another remarkable communications device was in the pipeline called the radio. And the radio would have the capacity for individual suppliers to broadcast and announce their products over large areas. Those people would get in their new automobiles after they had used the telephone to call up the merchant, and they would drive to another location to buy goods and services. And the broad-based advertising posed an enormous challenge to the new institution in deciding what standards should be applied for truthfulness in advertising. And on the entertainment side of things, there was this new upheaval in the system called moving pictures. And moving pictures and the way in which they were distributed would transform the way in which individuals would seek entertainment. And it's a medium that still changes our lives today, although we see it through different venues than they did at that time. All of these were bewildering sources of upheaval. So the problem for competition agencies, for consumer protection agencies, has always been the rate of change is intense, and I would say not entirely different today, but perhaps in absolute and relative terms, faster and more dynamic. If you're the public agency, and let's go back to Cass's slides, and you're thinking about how to nudge, how do you know where to nudge? Where do you push? What basis of knowledge do you draw upon to make these judgments? And in a highly complex, dynamic sector, how do you know in which direction the appropriate push should take place? All of you have in your pockets, Chris mentioned, asked you to turn them off, that little device in your pocket. When I was a kid, the telephone was a heavy black object attached by a cord to the wall. It was black. AT&T and its subsidiary Western Electric did not make them in other colors. If you wanted a white phone, Western Electric would say through AT&T, when it's time to have a white phone, we'll let you know. Moreover, we'll let you know when it's a good idea to put one on a wall with a long cord. And the idea that that little machine would be a telephone, a camera, a computer, a moving picture screen for you to look at, a GPS if you want it that way, was completely unimaginable. How many of you want to predict what that machine's going to look like 5 years from now and what it will do? How many of you predicted 5 years ago what it would be doing now? If you had an accurate prediction about that, and who would be making that phone, you're here today only because of intellectual curiosity, not because of any financial need. Because your portfolios would reflect where the market was going, and you would have done very well indeed. And to look again at how the upheaval in the supplier base changes. Schumpeter's little chapter from 1942 on innovation is still in its own way a powerful reminder of what competition does. He said that price competition sort of pushes open a door a bit. He says innovation-based competition is like a bombardment that just crushes existing establishments. If you thought back 15 years ago, who's going to be the leading maker of handsets? You'd get one answer. If you thought 10 years ago, who's going to be the leading purveyor of devices for businesses, mobiles? Well, of course, it's the unstoppable BlackBerry, holding on by its fingernails now. How many of you at one point grew up with cameras that relied on something called photographic film? Eastern Kodak had the choice to go into digital or to rely on film. It made a choice to stay on film and make digital secondary. It is now a firm in name only with a little bit in an IP portfolio. That's all they've got. All of these changes suggest the rapidity and the rate at which change takes place in these sectors. An enormous difficulty for the competition agency is to understand what's going on. If you want to test yourself on this, just ask, what exactly is it that search engines do? What is Google doing now? What is Amazon doing now? What is Facebook doing now? What is Apple doing now? And if you want to test yourself on your ability to look ahead or even understand what's going on now, take out a sheet of paper and write down where those firms are going to be 2 years from now and what their product offerings will be. Open it up and see how you did. If you're the competition agency or the consumer protection agency, that is a bewildering context in which to operate. The technological dynamism creates different policy issues which relate to the second point, and that is you often end up with a regulatory framework that is highly fragmented. By historical accident, you often get sector-based approaches to dealing with specific policy problems, and they tend to be hardwired in the system over time. They're hard to change. One of my big lessons in going to the FTC was to notice when you went to other public institutions at the national and state level, you might go to them thinking that you were going to find interest in developing cooperative solutions. Instead, you saw a policy archipelago in which when you landed on the beach, the natives came out with spears and torches rather than approached you with open arms, where they were much more interested in many instances of protecting the boundaries of the power and authority they had than dealing with common solutions. And as a competition agency, if you do competition work, you notice that you have dozens of shared property boundaries with other regulators who do something related to what you do. And the fragmentation in many respects also manifests itself in extraordinary complexity with respect to the resolution of any single issue. That is, you often are dealing as a regulator with competing policy impulses that tell you to do A, B, C, D, and E, and those internally are inconsistent. Take the issue of energy, or one species of energy, what in the United States we call gasoline, petrol for many others. What are the expectations socially of elected officials and individual consumers about energy generally, and certainly gasoline? Well, first, it ought to be cheap. And it is cheap by our standards. 1 gallon for us, 1 liter for you. That's roughly the exchange rate. But we think that's too expensive. So it's got to be cheap, it's got to be abundant, it has to be safe, no danger. I don't want pipelines that blow up. I don't want refineries that are set on fire. I don't want dangerous fuel cycles that have bad after effects like nuclear. I just want it to be safe. I want it to be reliable, of course. When I flip the switch, it's got to be on. When I turn the key, it's got to be in the tank. And oh yes, it has to be sourced someplace else. I don't want to look at it. Turbines are great as long as they're not in my field of vision. Solar's terrific, except the places where you can do lots of solar on a mass scale, they're far from the population centers, and high voltage electric transmission wires are so ugly to look at. I don't want to do that. You're the policymaker. This is the multivariable equation. You solve that equation. Conflicting impulses that tell the public authorities to do something differently. And if they all maximize their own individual policy mandate inside their own individual domain, you won't get outcomes that in some sense are coherent, or at least recognize the trade-offs among some of these policy objectives. That was another lesson for me in my time working with McDonnell Douglas, is trade-offs. One design engineer told me, you can make an airplane that goes a long distance, that carries a lot of people, or goes really fast. You can't do all three at once. Can't be done. That wonderful, handsome, short-lived product called the Concorde is a good example. It's a small airplane today. It's dwarfed by everything else. Those were one aisle, 4 seats in total, 2 and 2. It was a tiny airplane. And if you were more than 2 meters tall, you had to hunch over as you walked through the plane. It was a small plane. Why? Because to go as fast as necessary, it couldn't have a big, heavy plane, because it drank a lot of gas as it was to get where it was going. In this framework, it tells the policy official, you have to think very hard about coming up with solutions that deal with this complexity. Sometimes they succeed. I'll give you an example of a pre-behavioral economics FTC measure that was behavioral economics before it was behavioral economics. It's called the octane rating rule. If you look at a gasoline pump today in the US, you see a 2-digit number. That's the octane rating. That tells you about everything you need to know about what kind of gas to put in your tank. It doesn't tell you about additives, but it tells you the essential bit of information that you need to know about what's going to take care of your engine. It's a nice 2-digit number. 1 digit would be simpler. 2 digits, though, is readily understandable. 86, 89, and 93, those are the 3 things you need to know. That was a ferociously difficult measure to get through the agency and through the courts. That took the better part of 5 years to get through the entire process. Recognized today as a big success, a difficult element of risk-taking for the FTC when it did it in the early 1970s. Last observation, what makes it difficult? It's the incentives and behavioral features that affect the decision makers inside the agencies themselves. The only way you're going to solve the knowledge problem is a massive investment in knowledge itself. The public agency, just like the private agency, has to have a significant investment in what I would call policy research and development. A competition agency or consumer protection agency that does not have an R&D program of its own or an affiliation with external co-producers like universities is a dangerously weak institution. That's like a pharmaceutical company during the analyst discussion, when the analysts say, what's your R&D budget for the next 10 years? The pharma company says, we have none. Unless they have legacy programs that are doing well, the recommendation for that stock is sell. The policy agency to do good work in this area must make investments in R&D to get smarter and to know what it's doing. Those tend to be long-term capital investments. Problem? Most appointees to competition authority leadership have relatively short-term tenures. And they are faced with the dilemma, do I invest in the long term or do I consume for today? And all of the policy signals in the political process in most of the countries I'm familiar with say spend, consume. They don't say invest. And without the investment, you don't get these kinds of adjustments and improvements over time. Another thing about those officials, not only do they respond to the political incentives, but all those behavioral things that Cass had on the slide, those same forms of behavior affect public agency decision makers. They can be myopic. They can be subject to excessive optimism. They can engage in confirmation bias. The decision I made yesterday is the one I'm going to defend today, even though the facts have changed dramatically and I have to reassess. They are subject to all these biases, and when you walk through the door, through the gate into the agencies, and you take out the badge, and you swipe the badge, it does not suck all of these behavioral biases out of you so you can do your job and then give them back when you leave. You take them with you. And those same human frailties can affect the way that choices are made. And one way it affects those choices is that if you're a public official, there's a little voice on your shoulder in one of these agencies that says, consume today. Do things right now that put points on the board, score goals right now that the political process can see, so I get credit right now. Washington, D.C. has a favorite metaphor for decision makers, and the metaphor is the first thing you should do, this is a Kennedy School dictum, pick the low-hanging fruit. Washington, D.C. does not have a metaphor that says plant trees. Only a sucker plants trees because trees take a long time to grow. So you have people running around the mall with baskets trying to gather up the fruit, and when it's really cold, they even chop down the trees to warm their hands. And oh, the future? That's the next person's problem, that's not mine. And these incentives press in the direction away from the investments, not only in building knowledge, but in fixing the institution itself. If you look at the NMR, if you look at the OFT and the CC in the UK, why change those institutions? Why do major surgery? Usually we do major surgery when people are really sick. We don't do that for healthy organizations, and by any objective measure, the regime in the Netherlands, the regime in the United Kingdom, to pick two good examples, those were healthy organizations. Perfect, but in my business in academia, I grade on a curve. And when I grade on a curve, they did very well. They were in the front ranks of organizations. And if you were to ask people around the world, who do you regard as a successful institution, you would have put those predecessor organizations there. So why take those and do a makeover? The commitment to do that reflects a view that they can be still better, that they can improve. When I was an undergraduate, I had a part-time job working for a newspaper, and I would interview sports celebrities who sometimes would come to school. And I interviewed one who came, successful professional athlete. I said, can I see you? He said, I'm practicing. I only have time on Sunday morning. Come out at Sunday morning at 7 and meet me on the driving range. Sunday mornings were not my best time as an undergraduate. 7 o'clock least of all, but I was there. And I watched him hit ball after ball with every club for the better part of 3 hours. Afterwards, I asked him, I said, you've already won 9 major championships, pretty good. Why are you doing this? He said, I want to win 20. He didn't quite get there, only ended up with 18. But that was a pretty good job anywhere. And it's the institution, it's the system that wants to win 20 and is not happy with 9. That's the organization that's going to have the basis for setting the foundation for doing well in the future. The last thing about that political environment that I would emphasize is that in many respects it discourages risk-taking. The real breakthroughs that take place in public administration or in the private sector involve taking chances. You've got to gamble. There's no sure thing. And as with horse racing, you have to bet before the horses leave the gate. You cannot come back later and say, I'd like to bet on that one. That doesn't work. Anything worth doing involves major risks. To use my airplane example again, in public sector decision-making, we want people to do things that are big improvements, but we will execute them if they fail. The public sector demands absolute success, but take risks. Why can't you be like the successful business enterprises? But if anything doesn't work, your head's going to be on the block. Yet it is the willingness to take big risks that leads to big advances. You're familiar with the U2, not just the singing group, but the airplane that it was based on beforehand. Mid-1950s, the United States wants a way of taking some pictures over the Soviet Union, which doesn't want picture taking to take place. So there's a need for an airplane that's going to fly really high. The engine's got to be really reliable, no way to stop for help on the way. and you need a really good camera to take good pictures. The Air Force and the CIA went to an innovative design organization at Lockheed and said, would you do this for us? They said yes. From the day they signed the contract to the day of the first flight was 9 months for something that didn't exist. 9 months till the first flight. What did the contract look like? It was about 10 pages, and it said, what you promised to do is to build a plane that'll go a long distance, fly high, and take good pictures. Not a lot of specifications. And basically the risk there being, if it didn't work, well, the government had spent the money to no end. But it did. It was a big risk. It was a huge success. If it had failed, the hearings, the inquiries, the inquests, the human sacrifice that inevitably follows, all those things would have happened. In the public sector, we have no appreciation or understanding that real breakthroughs in performance are going to involve risk-taking. And if we don't want the innovation, we better pull the covers back over our heads and say, we want a government that just does okay. It's like a student whom you ask, what do you aspire to? I'd love to get a C+. My aim is to get a C+ and barely graduate. That's what I want to do. I aspire to the middle of the class. To a large extent, those are the signals we give public agency decision makers because we're so doubtful about the benefits of risk-taking. So where are we when we look at the ACM? It fits into a remarkable process of development and evolution in the field of competition law and consumer protection. When I finished law school in 1978, I talked to my advisor who said, what do you want to do with the law degree? And I said, I'd like a career in international competition law. He shook his head with great sadness and said, I can't possibly recommend that you go into a field that will never be important. In 1978, that was not a foolish bit of advice. I didn't anticipate in 1978 that the Soviet Union would unravel. I didn't anticipate that the Warsaw Pact would be a rock band and not an alliance. I didn't think that when you went into Prague, Budapest, Sofia, that when you went through the airport, there'd be a blue flag with gold stars on it. Completely unimaginable, but that's what happened. Nobody thought this would happen. 20 jurisdictions with competition laws in 1990, today over 125. That's more than 100 systems in barely 25 years. With it has come a remarkable degree of innovation and rethinking about the design of the institution and what it should do and how it should function. And where's the main innovation been taking place? In relatively newer systems. The old ones have a tendency to say, I've got it figured out, thanks. Certainly in my own country, where it's easier to list the institutions that cannot enforce the antitrust laws and those that can, there's a great sense that it's quaint, it's old, it's ours. We're not going to rethink it. But in so many other countries, and the Netherlands is a good example, you see a drive and persistence to ask, how can it be better? A couple of the big gambles, and I call them gambles. These are policy gambles because they don't have absolutely certain destinations, but I'll tell you why I think they're worth taking and why there's a promising basis to think that they'll work. First, the novel combination of functions. The ACM is like half of the world's competition authorities in that half of them are not just antitrust agencies. They do something else. They do consumer protection. That's the main something else. Some of them do public procurement. That's 20 of them. Some of them do intellectual property. Some of them do bankruptcy. It's a policy conglomerate. The agency I used to work for is a policy conglomerate. It has 3 main divisions: competition, consumer protection, data protection, privacy. A diverse conglomerate institution. ACM has 3 major functions: competition, consumer protection, and the telecom regulated sectors portfolio post. Other related features there too. This makes a lot of sense in many ways. The competition consumer protection package allows you to join up the demand and the supply side of the market. It gives you real insights into what's happening on both. That can be extremely valuable when you're dealing, for example, with the change in the regulatory structure for telecom or electricity. Because big questions are, do you have enough rivalry to drive suppliers to offer better deals? And when you do that, do consumers understand what's coming at them? The competition side is important. The Queen's comment about mobile. One thing that competition officials around the world have done very successfully is to say the right number of mobile operators is at least 2, not 1. Because in country after country, where the question was posed, especially in emerging markets, who should be the mobile operator, the incumbent invariably raised its hand and said, I'm available, and I think I should get the only license. Most jurisdictions did not do that. Those numbers on adoptions, the penetration rate that the Queen mentioned, competition did that. But competition alone doesn't tell you how to understand the bill. It doesn't tell you how to understand the charges. It doesn't necessarily tell you what you've signed up to. And that's where the consumer protection dimension can do a great job of helping you understand what's there and having firms engage in meaningful disclosure so they understand what's going on. Lots of the disclosures, by the way, the government's mandate are not terribly informative. When I was at the FTC, we did an empirical study of disclosures involving mortgage lending. We did focus groups where we gave consumers a test. We said, here are 3 sets of terms. Pick the one that's best for you. There was a correct answer. The humbling result, 1/3 of the readers could figure it out. We went back to the bank regulators and said, we don't design these. You might be interested in knowing what's going on. First problem, we crossed that dangerous divide into the realm of another agency, and we were shoved back pretty hard. But we said, in case you're interested, we're just going to leave this on the table. Why don't you read it at your leisure? Their response was, we understand what these means. What's the problem? We said, yes, you, the lawyers who know what these mean, we drafted them. I don't doubt you did. But ordinary human beings don't know what's there. So disclosures that don't disclose in a meaningful way are perhaps worse than useless. They could be affirmatively misleading, where the results are random or systematically bad. So the combination of the two makes sense. The joining up of what's taking place in these transitional sectors, the vexing problems that are associated with universal service obligations, those as well, I think, properly have a place inside of one agency. And now we have extraordinary experiments. The older experiment in Australia, the newer experiment in the Netherlands to test the efficacy of this process. What's the gamble? Putting them together because there are conceptual synergies doesn't mean that the synergies happen automatically. Just because you take disparate institutions and put them under one roof doesn't mean they work well together. It can take a long time before they go saying we to saying us in describing what the agency's doing and talk about common issues. This was a continuing challenge for me when I was at my agency. I share with you a story I've shared with my colleagues and friends at the ACM. I've just become the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, 1,300 people in my agency. I meet with the head of our consumer protection group and I say, can you give me the printout? It's on a spreadsheet of all the current matters in the Bureau of Consumer Protection and the status of those matters. Can you print that out for me? In unison, the head of the office and her deputy said, why do you need that? I thought for a second of replying, because I'm the blank blank chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, I don't have needs. If I am the captain on the bridge and you're the lieutenant at the wheel and I say, come to course 270, the correct answer is not to say, but why? Wouldn't 265 be better? The correct answer is, aye, aye, sir, 270. I didn't do that. I'm a friendly academic. I don't use that hierarchical style. So I explained why it could be helpful to me to know this. It took me 3 weeks to get that document, which involved taking a finger and pressing print in order to push the document out. A great difficulty in my agency is achieving in practice the synergies. They happen, they take place. They took place dramatically in one of the biggest risk-taking matters that the agency took when I was there. In the early part of the previous decade, we adopted a measure dealing with telemarketing sales called the do not call rule. It allows consumers to opt into a registry that telemarketers must respect if the individual wishes not to be called. Interesting mechanism. They have to opt in. In choosing the opt-in rule, we chose it because we'd done work that told us that there were enough people who wanted it that they do it. We didn't set the default as being you're off. The default is you can be called, but you have to jump in. And we had a good idea that they would. 3 big risks. The law, our freedom of speech protection in the Constitution, raised questions about whether a public agency could do that filtering function. Second, we had to have a technical system that would accept the registrations and meaningfully list them and give them to the firms. Third, there would be political backlash from those who went about providing these existing services. All 3 of those were huge risks. On the first day that the system went live, our servers crashed because tens of thousands of people were calling up every couple of minutes. Over 250 million US phone calls are now registered. We had a recovery plan. It was back the second day. But each of these involved risks. We could have fallen right on our face, and it was by a narrow margin that we succeeded in the legal challenges that came. But without taking the big risk, we would not have come up with what is one of the 2 or 3 most consumer valuable items that the agency has accomplished in its century. Second problem is building a cohesive strategy. You have to have and announce to the outside world and engage in a discussion about what you're going to do and explain why you're doing it. And for many agencies, that's awkward, especially if your legislature is compelling you to make policy choices among inconsistent goals. There's a tendency to issue vague, general expressions of what you mean to do because you can hide in the fog. And there's a nervousness about making clear we mean to do this. These are our priorities. If you don't like ours, suggest your own. But let's have a discussion about that. And there again, on both of these fronts, integration, strategy, disclosure, the ACM's off to a really good start, I think. Last point is you have to have the right portfolio of tools. Problem here is, how do you get graded if you're a competition agency or consumer protection agency? How many cases did you bring? Oh, I engaged in advocacy. Oh, please spare me. The legislator says, how many cases? Let me tell you about the interesting disclosure thing I did. I read this interesting nudge book, and we're doing some of that. We're doing little pushes, and they say, little pushes, these are bad guys. They're really bad. We give you $300 million a year, and you're nudging them? We want you to shove them off the cliff and hold them there for a while until they relent. We don't want nudges. We want full-throated, forceful enforcement, and those are cases. That's how you get graded, for the most part. The other stuff doesn't show up on the report card. It is a struggle to persuade the political environment that these other things are important, that the broader portfolio of tools matters. Final thought. Why is today's event useful? One reason is that it reflects what I think is part of the virtuous cycle of policymaking. 3 steps. You start by experimenting, as you must, and you take chances. Step 2, you evaluate and assess. Cass's last point this morning, you assess how it's turning out. Oh, is it difficult to measure? Sure. But to say that you're not going to do it is like a student who looks at a difficult question on the exam and says, I don't want to answer your question. Here's a question I'd prefer to answer. I'll answer that one. You don't get an A for that. Do your best to answer my hard question. If you're not doing that, you're not doing a good job. In step 3, you make adjustments based on what you've learned. You do those 3 things repeatedly, you have an institution that succeeds, that updates, adapts, and improves over time. And if you're doing that, that last step evaluation, usually no credit for that in the policy world. Who cares? Just crank out more cases. Do more of that. The view is, I can't afford to evaluate how well I'm doing because I have so much more stuff to do. That's like a doctor saying, after the operation, I'm not going to see you for post-op care because I've got more surgery to do. Well, do you know if the surgery you're doing now is working? Don't have time to tell. Time to open up another body and get to work. Nobody practices medicine like that. but it's an investment in the future. And if you take on internally, and I think the ACM has, the view that the future is really important for the agency and it's the long term that matters and it's not the short term credit claiming opportunity that counts, you have the basis for success. Fred Hilmer was instrumental in the design and development of Australia's competition policy enhancements in the 1990s. Fred teaches in the business school at the University of New South Wales. He was the dean there. I asked him once, what do you tell your executive MBAs? He says, I tell them this. I tell them that the good things that are happening in your organizations today are probably the results of investments that your predecessors made 10 years ago. And what I want you to do when you go back to your office is to think every day, what did I do today to make my successor, a person I don't even know, who comes along in 5 or 10 years, better off when they do the job then? That's the formula for a good agency. I see that spirit in the ACM. Thank you.